Welcome, everyone. We'll get started. My name's Dylan Rodriguez. I'm here in my capacity as co-director for the Center for Ideas and Society. I'm here representing my co-director, Jeanette Cole, our executive director, Catherine Henshaw. And I want to start by offering an acknowledgement of our institutional conditions alongside an anti-colonial urging. I open this occasion by acknowledging Rupert and Jeanette Costo's institutional legacy of reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence, including epistemological, archival, and physical forms of Indigenous thought and being. The University of California is a settler colonial institution that occupies the unceded land and ecology that remains inhabited by original and ongoing human caretakers, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples. This colonial institution continues to be populated by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is close to the site where 19-year-old Taisha Miller's life was stolen by the Riverside Police Department in 1998. This is also the campus where a former chancellor once casually told two longtime faculty members that his instructions to campus police officers was to shoot student protesters below the knees with their so-called non-lethal weapons. It is a shared responsibility to address how this state institution is complicit in long and ongoing histories of anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. It's thus with a sense of humble gratitude and an urgent obligation that I offer these words in place of the sanctioned institutional land acknowledgement. I'm honored to open this precious occasion by offering myself as your potential collaborator in efforts to build on Rupert and Jeanette Costo's example by seeking new and old ways to create decolonized abolitionist and liberated futures. Welcome. A quick reminder that this event is being recorded. Live transcription is available if you click the proper button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The format of the meeting will go as such. We will ask our moderator to offer some framing comments and introduce our author. We will then have a discussion and conversation for the majority of the hour. We'll close with some question and answer that will invite you all, the attendees, to engage with both our moderator and our author. And then we'll close things up right around 4 o'clock. Use the chat for questions. We don't have the Q&A function. We'll be using the chat for questions, so feel free to utilize that. It's my privilege to introduce our moderator. Dr. Jade S. Sasser is Associate Professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. Her work explores race, class, and gender at the nexus of climate change and women's bodies, rights, and reproduction. She's the author of this tremendous award-winning book, On Infertile Ground, Population Control and Women's Rights in the Era of Climate Change, published in 2018 by NYU Press. Sasser, Jade, is currently completing a book on eco-anxiety and its impacts on young people's reproductive plans. She holds a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Jade.
Thank you so much, Dylan. And I am thrilled to be here today. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to be today's moderator and introduce my department colleague and friend, Dr. Victoria Reyes. Dr. Reyes is an associate professor, also in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. She is the author of the multi-award-winning book, Global Borderlands, Fantasy, Violence, and Empire, as well as her more recent book, Academic Outsider, Stories of Exclusion and Hope, which is the book that we are here to discuss today. Her research has also been published in Social Forces, Theory in Society, Ethnography, and Sociological Methods in Research, along with other peer-reviewed outlets, and her work has also appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and Inside Higher Ed. Reyes has received fellowships, grants, and awards from the NSF, the American Association of University Women, American Sociological Association, and the Association for Asian American Studies, among others. Welcome, Dr. Reyes, Victoria. I am so thrilled to be in conversation with you today about this book.
Well, first, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and for everyone here today. I'm so nervous. I'm so nervous, but I appreciate kind of your in-depth engagement. I look forward to this conversation, and thank you to everyone who's here.
I do have to say, we have been talking about this conversation for a long time. So I understand the nervousness, but this is a celebration. And by way of framing this conversation for those of you in attendance, I first encountered this book in a writing group with Victoria about 1.5 years ago. And in that group, the members of the group, we were supposed to just read one chapter. Everyone submitted chapters, one article, one chapter at a time. Victoria sent the PDF of the entire manuscript and she told us which chapter to read. And so I, of course, being very curious, went ahead and read the entire thing, unbeknownst to her. And the reason why I read the entire thing was because that first chapter was so compelling and because I could not put it down. I was completely blown away by how this book rendered my entire experience on the page. Specifically, my experience of being in graduate school, for example, the experiences that I thought were individual and specific and unique to only me. The isolation of being a woman of color in grad school in a top program that I had been conditioned to aspire to. But when I arrived and did everything that I was supposed to do to achieve success, I wondered why I constantly felt like I was failing. The same experience was also replicated and intensified on the tenure track, when suddenly the demands of service work were added to research, teaching, and writing, and when my relentless drive to overachieve and prove myself worthy of the role seemed to be met at every turn with the feeling that I still somehow was not doing enough. And then the deep, persistent fear that I was also somehow failing students by not adequately preparing them for the demands of a profession that, despite many people's rather strident insistence to the contrary, does not and never has hired, evaluated, promoted, or retained people based on merit alone, but rather systematically produces and reproduces conditions of inclusion and exclusion, or conditional citizenship, against which we are constantly struggling to survive, not to mention dreaming of being able to thrive. All of this is in this powerful, very, very necessary book. And finally, the book is rendered through the frameworks and languages of Black feminism, both in terms of calling out the nature of systemic and structural patriarchy and racist misogyny, but also in the vein of reclaiming the ability to resist, to transform, and in doing so, to achieve academic justice. Okay, so I apologize, my voice is a little shaky. I have a cold, but we'll get through it. All right, so Victoria, the first question is for those who haven't read the book. I wonder if you can tell us at a basic level, what is an academic outsider and what do race, gender, and class have to do with this construct?
Yeah, sure. And I just have to say, you've never told me that before, that you've read the entire manuscript. Oh my gosh. So great question. So there are a few levels to this. On one hand, most everyone can relate to being an outsider and not fitting in, right, in some ways. And so in that way, it can speak to a wide range of people. And that's one of like the questions one of the reviewers of the manuscript brought up. Aren't academics all outsiders? And to some extent, that is true. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, like I really draw on Black feminist thought. I'm not a Black feminist. I can't produce Black feminist thought, but it speaks to me and about the parallels, about structural positions and uplifting one another. And so for me, thinking about thinking about an outsider, right, whose contours are racialized, gendered, sex-classed, and embodied, right? And it's not dichotomous, either you are or another. That would take away what Patricia Collins talks about as an outsider within, people within a social space, but in its margins, right? And fluid and situational. And so here I really draw on kind of thinking about a racialized outsider, drawing on the likes of people like Anna Julia Cooper, W.B. Du Bois, thinking about double consciousness and veil. And what that means, they are writing as kind of Black people in a particular place and time. What does that mean for us as non-Black racialized outsiders? And what does it mean when our veil is more porous? What does it mean when it's not as thick? And so an academic outsider is separated from other academics and from university life more generally by our lived experiences, how the structures of the modern academy aren't built for us, right? It was built for white, cis, heterosexual married men, right? And so thinking about opening up that door to understand kind of the racialized contours of what it means to be an outsider. And here, you could even kind of think about Elijah Anderson's work on kind of white space, right? He has this article, and then his book just came out, maybe this year, maybe it was last year, about, and I quote, right, he refers to white spaces as the perceptual categorization of spaces based on the overwhelming proportion of white people there. He compares the overwhelmingly number of white people in those spaces to the relative absence of Black people who, when present, and I quote, reflexively note the proportion of whites to Blacks, or may look around for other Blacks with whom to commune if not bond. When judging a setting as too white, they may feel uneasy and consider it to be informally off limits. So in my experience, brown people often reflexively think and experience white spaces in similar ways. And so that's kind of the crux of the argument, is thinking about academic outsiders as racialized people who are marginalized in the academy. So that was a long answer to get to that point.
Perfect answer. Thank you. So what inspired you to write this book, and why did you write it when you did?
Yeah, so this book, I wrote the first drafts in summer going into fall of 2020. COVID-19, the first year of the pandemic, combined with the renewed attention to Black Lives Matter and the murder of unarmed Black people, and thinking about how this all accumulated. And for me, like so many others, my life collapsed. It broke into a million pieces, and it's still not put together again. And so at Cellar Door, I had an event. I started crying. I'm going to try not to cry at this event. It's different. It's not as intimate, but I may tear up. So if my voice shakes, that's why. And I try very hard in my life to compartmentalize my personal life, my professional life, all of these things. And COVID just brought those walls down. And so I had my now 8 and 4-year-old, at the time 6 and 2-year-old, both at home. My grandmother had a heart attack a few months before the school shutdowns. And so it's just the 4 of us. And I did a lot of caretaking for my grandma in terms of her medical appointments, medications. I still do that. And then having both kids at home. And so for those of you who, I do service work with in the academy, if you would have had a meeting with me at any time, you would see my kids running around the place. My daughter would literally hang upside down from her loft bed. And it just broke me. And I think it also, in addition to bringing the walls down, my mom died in 2018, and we had a tumultuous relationship, as if I talk about in the book. And I think Olivia, having a hard time with the pandemic and acting out as kids do, really forced me to grapple and process the death of my mother, process my complicated feelings and our tumultuous relationship. And how do I not pass on generational trauma when it's so easy, right? Like my grandma has, slapped me across the face for talking back. And I'm like, sometimes I'd be like, oh, I can see how you give in. I can see how you can give in, and you can't, right? Like violence is not the answer, to not take out, to not do all of these things. And so that's how the book came out. And honestly, I feel like it was, I look back and I can't, it poured out of me, right? Like that's what happened. It poured out of me. And then I worked, and the theoretical parts, I feel like this book is very theoretical. It was a lot of work, but it was just me as a way of processing the trauma that was all around me, the world on fire, and all of the decades of therapy I've had.
Wow. And that comes through on the page. I have to say, the entire thing is an intense read, but your COVID-19 chapter was particularly intense, and it demonstrated the stark disparities through which different communities experience the pandemic, including within the academy. Can you talk a bit more about these differences and how they are structural? rather than simply being, individual experiences. And then if you can, how they're further perpetuated by academic institutions.
Yeah, so one of the things I think COVID did was it didn't create these problems. It deepened and revealed these fissures that are already happening, right? And so we can think about even pre-pandemic, the ways in which the university system is built on, for example, the reimbursement model, and how that disproportionately impacts people who are first-gen working class, lower income, who have to put all of these things like me on credit cards, take months to get reimbursed, often not even, being able to get all of the expenses paid for by my research funds, right? Sorry about that. I have a Google password thing. So it's thinking about that. It's thinking about how the structures of motherhood, right, is not made for the academy, even in places like women's liberal arts colleges, and that being a mother, having to, especially solo parenting, having to pick up kids, do homework, all of these attending things, what COVID did is it intensified it even more. And when we think about COVID and how the school shutdowns happen, when you think about families for whom don't have, one, who have a multi-generational household. And so you have very vulnerable people. And when we think about when people say how the pandemic disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities, it's not because of biological essentialism, right? It's because of structural positions. It's because of vulnerability. It's because of stress of racism. It's because of these lower income jobs and first generation status. And so all of that is compounded. So me, I would get these emails on the weekend, right? Friday, during the first summer in the pandemic, an email from a colleague. Monday, then telling me how I wasn't being courteous by responding to an email. And this is in the summer, the first summer of the pandemic. Kids have been at home. And it was for some people, the COVID forced them at home and they were more productive, right? White men who have resources, white families who had multiple kind of people at home, who had two-parent households if they had kids. It was still hard, yes, but the levels of resources you can draw on, the levels of risk involved, or how kind of the university is built on this neoliberal individualism, right? And when you don't think that way, when you think about the community, right? And you don't take risks, right? Or you still have to go out and do work because you have to, and that's how you get money. And so it's all of these things that just exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think in terms of how is it perpetuated by academic institutions, right? I think one of the things I talk about in the book is COVID impact statements, right? On the surface, these seem like a good idea, right? This is a chance. Universities have faculty give a chance to explain how the COVID pandemic kind of stopped your research or halted your productivity. But in practice, what it did is it asks you to take on even more labor on your precious time when you are behind on everything and trying to calculate what are the hours you lost. And so you spend more time not doing your research, not doing kind of childcare, not doing anything, but trying to justify why the pandemic impacted you, instead of the university and administration taking on that role, instead of kind of thinking about not having to prove or to even vote on whether or not people agree the pandemic voted on you. The system just sets up this feeling of being questioned and not trusted and having to prove. And it's not about data. The data could be me telling you. The data shows how the pandemic disproportionately impacted people. So why aren't you looking at that data and doing a more structural solution?
Absolutely. And you talked elsewhere in the book about the experience of living in precarity. And the COVID chapter also really highlighted how those forms of precarity were exacerbated during the pandemic and also replicated by academic institutions. I wonder if we can switch gears here and talk more about the central concept of the book, which is this notion of conditional citizenship in the academy. So can you tell us more about that concept and the difference between holding rights and having responsibilities as a conditional citizen of academia?
Yeah, so there's kind of like everything, there are like multiple layers, right? So first is citizenship is actually already popular parlance in the academy, right? People talk about, oh, are you a good departmental citizen? Are you a good college citizen? Which talks about like your service responsibilities, right? Bruce McFarlane has this, I forget if it's a book or an article about exactly this, academic citizenship as service and why service is a good thing. With that kind of citizenship is also racialized, gendered, sexed, and class in terms of what kind of citizen, what kind of service is valued and what is not valued. But in terms of rights, here I really talk about, I'm trained as a sociologist, I'm a sociologist. Sociologists talk about citizenship, right? About legal status, but also belonging and political participation as sets of practices and claims making regarding holding up and investing in a nation state, right? But you also have people like Aiwa Ong, Jean Beeman, who is here somewhere, read her book, Citizen Outsider, her first book, and read the second book when it comes out, but about cultural practices and beliefs, right? Becoming a citizen depends on how one is constituted as a subject who exercises or submits to power relations, right? That's what Aiwa Ong says. And here, you see our colleague, Laila Lalami has a book called Conditional Citizenship, and it's about her relationship to the state and people like her, whose, and I quote, rights the states find expendable in pursuit of white supremacy. The same thing can be thought of as academic life, right? And so here, when I use the term academic citizenship, I talk about rights, responsibilities, as well as a sense of belonging, access to political participation. And so conditional citizenship is really predicated on this idea that exclusion in the academy is not just one thing, right? It's not just, oh, we admitted students, we like hired this many, faculty of color, right? But it's actively and continually being excluded, and constant reminders of who belongs in the academy and who doesn't. And this is seen through microaggressions. It's seen in what kind of research is considered important, what kind of research is considered, me search and therefore devalued. It's about like the readings in class. Who are the authors? What are they talking about? What is considered the canon or foundational? As well as in terms of service, right? Like what kind of service matters? What kind of service is important? And many, many people have talked about the invisible service that women of color in particular take on in terms of mentoring that is just devalued. But one of the things, right? So one of the reviewers in the book also was like, oh, you should include more instances of racism you experienced. And I didn't. In part because those things are easily dismissed, right, and individualized. So what I did instead was focus on this very particular UC-specific bylaw 55, which is, for those of you not in the know, or even people who are in departments where it's not so contentious, it's a UC-wide bylaw that departments are supposed to vote on, or at least say we continue the previous one. And it's about rights associated with hiring, merits, and promotions at each level, right? So full and associates vote on whether assistants can vote on hiring, assistants hiring, associates hiring, full professors. Those are 3 different votes. Whether they can kind of vote on the promotion to associate, right, on tenure, and then associate merits and full merits. And then full professors vote on canned associates, vote on merits for full. And in my previous department, not in my current department, but in my previous department, it was so contested every single year, felt like. And it was, we were asked to do much of the work and the responsibilities in terms of being asked to be on what we called an advocacy committee, where you draft the letter. on files I couldn't even vote on a promotion to full, on a merit for an associate, or in hiring, being involved. Some people were on a hiring committee, couldn't vote on that hire because they were associate level, being asked to participate in terms of the going to job talks, backstage conversations, going to dinners, being a part of the conversations about hiring, all without having the right to vote on it. And so for me, really thinking about how kind of Bylaw 55 exemplifies these differentiations of rights, right? And who is expected to contribute to labor, and are your rights aligned? And of course, as a tenure track, now tenured faculty, we're very privileged in comparison to the adjunctification of the academy, who often don't have any rights, who get paid even less, and whose value is not considered important to the university, right? And so, right, so when I talk about this tenure track, I also understand that it's also a privileged conversation and part of a larger conversation about how conditional citizenship has many contours, and adjunctification is a part of that, as well as graduate students, as well as staff members, as well as are people provided with resources to do their job and be treated with this respect and dignity. Like, that should not be a high bar, but it is, unfortunately.
Everything that you're talking about reminds me so much of many conversations that we have had and that I've had with others, which is, and this is not a question on the list, I'm riffing here, but which is the issue of how so often there is a focus on recruiting new faculty of color in particular, but seemingly very, very little or often no focus on effectively retaining people. And then when people leave, whether it's leaving a department or leaving an institution or leaving academia altogether, the focus gets put on the pull factors. Oh, they found a more attractive job. Oh, they're at an institution that has more money and is better resourced and is paying them a higher salary. But very often what I have found is that there are more push factors that are pushing people to leave where they are, rather than pull factors that make another institution or non-academic institutions that much more attractive. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this focus on recruitment versus retention and the push-pull factors.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you've said, and I think it's right on point, 100%. I with my daughter, I start to speak in text speak, so excuse me. And what it reminds me of is Nancy Leong, Leong, for anyone who wants to look, has this book called Identity Capitalism. And it's precisely this use of kind of racially marginalized peoples as a way to kind of show progress without actually committing to that process. Same thing with Sarah Ahmed has this wonderful book on being included, and how it's about diversity officers in universities, and how when you raise the problem of racism, you become the problem, right? So let me unpack that, because it seems like not quite a linear connection to what you said, which is that what often counts are the numbers, right? And it's about, as you mentioned, it's recruiting. But, a lot of people now are, especially kind of right-wing politics is all about how the universities are hotbeds of liberalism and you're brainwashing, whatever. But in fact, I find that the university is very conservative. And that conservative aspect means that racism, gendered racism, and other forms of hate and exclusion are not addressed, right? That tenured faculty, it's not the matter that you can't hold tenured faculty accountable, it's that people don't want to, right? And because people who are in power don't want to change the system. But the system is what pushes people out, right? As well as just general treatment of like a lack of dignity, right? It becomes this neoliberal model of output, output, output. A lot of people in power are like, I had to go through this, you're the same. And they are these gatekeepers, right? And they see as more for others as less for themselves. And that's a problem. And it's a problem of not holding people accountable. And so what you see is exactly what you said. You get this carousel. A lot of people come in, but then everyone leaves because of how they're treated. And yeah, other places may have more resources, but that's not what is pushing them out. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I agree with everything you said. And I think that it's short-sighted, and it gets at a surface level understanding of the problem and not at the root cause, right? The root cause is we don't have faculty of color because we cannot retain them, because we do not support them, because all of these other reasons. So we have to understand the root causes rather than these kind of superficial fixes and band-aids that don't really change anything.
Absolutely. I do just want to remind people, we're going to move into discussion in about 7 or 8 minutes. So if you are already finding things that you'd like to comment on or that you have questions about, please do put them in the chat and we'll get to them in order. Okay, so throughout the book, you lay out systematically all of these deep systemic challenges. And then you have this beautiful chapter at the end that is shockingly about love. Love as a framework for how the academy can actually be transformed in ways that can recuperate kind of the highest ideals of what many people come to the professoriate or to the academy to do. So I was very curious as I was reading through that chapter, why love? And what does love have to do with what you refer to as academic justice?
Yeah, so there's like 2 answers to that question. One is the essay really bookends kind of the beginning, right? And so I think that you can't talk about that without what to me is the central part of the book, in part because it's like the most intimate, which is my essay on love and worth. And I talk about love because it stems from what it's like to be and feel unlovable when you are the product of rape, and when you have this kind of tumultuous relationship with my mother, when I feel like an outsider in my own family, when you have these kinds of precarity, when you have like, so to me, thinking about kind of, if we look at love as capital, as used by individuals, as bundles of practices, as something that's also structural and unevenly distributed, as love, as what we recognize as worthy and worthiness, and value, and valuable. And so the last chapter really has to give credit to a few people. One is Crystal Fleming, who's at Stony Brook, who was a manuscript reader when this book didn't even have that last chapter. And she really pushed me. So all that was about love was that first chapter. And she was like, I don't know if this is the message you want to send. And let's remember kind of bell hooks. Let's remember all of these kind of Black feminist thinkers. Like, is that really like, that's not how love should be. And I was like, well, I like that chapter, and that's the chapter that poured out of me. But her thoughts and her pushing me to think made me, like, I reread and read her recommendations. And then what came out, and I see Zakia here, and I wish I had the book. It's actually, my copy is at home. But Zakia Luna and Whitney Purtle have this edited volume of Black feminist sociology. And in their introductory essay, one of the things they call for is for a loving sociology, right? And what that means, and here I want to, and for me, when I read their work and that essay, it spoke to me in so many ways. And I think that well, we can get in that if we talk about the academic, because I have the page, academic outsider, the justice aspect, but it spoke to me in so many ways, this call for loving sociology, and then reading Bell Hooks's work on love. And so I think for me, I just wanted to read an excerpt from how I was thinking in the first chapter to how I was thinking in the last, or it's not the first chapter, but I think of it that way because it's the first chapter I wrote. For me, the message that I was unloved and unlovable came first and loudest from my mother. But every time we're rejected, treated differently, or dismissed, whether by our families, our communities, or our social institutions, we're being told that we're unloved and unworthy. When states and cities don't invest in public schools, when managers treat their workers with suspicion, when authority figures discount our experiences because of our race, gender, sexuality, we're being told that we do not deserve their investments of time, money, and attention. Whether we're talking about relationships, family, or society writ large, the experience of being loved is rooted in recognition and resources. Being denied those resources and recognition marks us as unloved, the essence of what it means to be an outsider. So then the concluding chapter, I want to read something I quote from Black feminist sociology, which is, academic justice requires centering academic life around the principles of Black feminist sociology. And here, I think, again, we need to move away from kind of this focus on individual achievements, right? It can't be about me. This focus on Black feminist sociology is about community. It's about uplifting Black women in particular. It's about uplifting others. And so this individualized aspect of the academy and the US more broadly is harmful. This goes for sociologists and non-sociologists alike. Zakiya Luna and Whitney N. Laster Pirtle state that Black feminist sociology is creative, undefined, transformative, humanizing, and loving. Abiding by these principles would mean trusting Black women, attending to joy, remaining mindful of ethics, and remembering, and I quote, that knowledge is a collective process that requires uplifting one another. Black feminist sociology enacts Black author Toni Morrison's call to action, that the function of freedom is to free somebody else.
Absolutely. So here's our last question and a reminder to everyone to start to put your comments into the chat. So our books are our creative sort of hopes and dreams on the page. And in many cases, we love our books, even if we didn't love the process of writing them. So this book, what are your highest hopes and dreams for what this book can and will do? Are there things that you're hopeful will happen, or changes that you're hopeful will be made in academic institutions like UCR or elsewhere as a result of academic outsider being in the world?
That's a big question. If I ruled the world, if I were to academia, it'd be very different. And so I was trying to think of like, what are some principles? Because in the essay, I talk about like practical things. And I think one is Black feminist sociology and really kind of centering that and Black feminists at the center of intellectual production. I also think centering the humanity of all involved, right? That really rooting recognition and the humanity of people and taking that into account, and how equality does not equal equity. And if we want equity, we have to understand that. It's about accountability. It's about accountability for each other, accountability to ourselves, but also accountability for kind of racism, gendered racism that occurs, right? And it's about what Bell Hooks, and I know that other people talk about integrity, but I really like Bell Hooks's definition of the term, which is about making sure like our words and our actions match in everything we do, right? And although we'll fall short, constantly fall short, it's this trying, it's this wanting to. And so thinking about if our mission is to be more inclusive, having our actions match that, right? And thinking about practices of care that are rewarded. And again, deviating away from kind of individual rewards and the star system of which the academy is built on, and really kind of thinking about creating a system where everyone is provided with resources they need to do a job. That's what we want to do, is we want to do our job, right? And be treated with dignity and respect. And that shouldn't be a high bar.
Absolutely. So there is a question that came in through the chat about whether people can ask their questions live and not through the chat. Do you have a preference? We will do whatever you prefer as the author.
Sure. Yes. And that's fine. I see that Ghassan has a question, and I'm fine with kind of taking it live if people want to raise their hand. And we might not be able to get to everyone, but I'm fine. Thank you for asking.
Okay, Ghassan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for this beautiful event. And thank you, Victoria, for this amazing book that I've read twice now. And I keep having questions when I attend these talks. So I'm going to make it short. It's harder for me to type a question than to say it out loud. My two questions for you. First, one of the thank yous that I really return to all the time is your centering of class as well, which we always forget about in the academy. And we talk sometimes about race and gender and sexuality, and just having class there up front and center really is so important for us to reckon with, which is something we don't want to reckon with in the academy. And then what comes to mind, it reminds me of the phrase that Martin Manolanson uses, the shock of the familiar, right? It's so familiar, yet I'm shocked, but I'm not shocked at the same time, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. For those of us who leave, you've spoken about your stories a lot, who leave disciplinary departments and end up in interdisciplinary departments. There's so many of us out there who were pushed out, right? But then thinking about intersectionality, not from a multi-scalar position, but from a position of now you're a different target, because you're targeted differently when you're in this department. Let's say if you ask, for example, asking questions can be seen as you're being aggressive. For me as an Arab, person, me asking a question with my hand gestures, they get scared. I've been told that a lot. Like, I am an aggressive person. So my question to you, Victoria, is shifting away from just thinking about conservatives or people who are very invested in the system knowingly, because you show us the nuances. What can you tell us about spaces that are based on all the ideals you're talking about, where then you find the same thing happening again, when it's a lot of virtue signaling, when it's a lot of respect Black women, yet we still don't listen to Black women, and then you find yourself in a bind. So the hope that you end with, which is really life-giving and makes me think of Munoz's educated hope. What happens though when you feel you keep shifting spaces and it's the same, it's just done differently? It's done with, we're all in this project together, but we're not really. We really are not. But just because it becomes a department that values or puts images and posters and signs doesn't make it less any violent, actually makes it more violent, because I would expect that more in certain departments than in others. And then I had a question about academic freedom, but for another day maybe. But sorry, I don't know if that made sense, Victoria, but how can we make sense of these spaces that are supposed to be radical, yet always fail?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, when I talk about conservative, I guess what I'm talking about is, yes, there are conservatives in terms of like maybe Trumpers or something, but conservative as in maintaining the system. And so I think like that's what we can kind of run into, where, people of color, it's not bioessentialism that, like that is kind of a misconception of people who don't really read, but say they've read work, that it's not necessarily about, identity and like your skin color, but it's because it's a structural position, right? Like, and Patricia Collins talks about this in terms of outsider within, and kind of being privy to kind of these white worlds, but occupying this structurally different position, and how that shapes our lived experiences. So when I talk about conservativeness, I talk about it as investment in the system. And so there are a lot of spaces, and you would think like sociology would be like one of those places where you study inequality, and ergo people are committed to eradicating inequality, but that's not the case, right? That people are invested in a system. And part of this is respectability politics. Part of this is, you know, people are able to kind of get to where they're at by doing certain things. And so, you know, I don't think it's necessarily malicious, but then you kind of reproduce this in your mentoring of how to help people. But then the question becomes navigating these spaces, right? Rather than thinking about like, how can we transform the space instead of how do you navigate this space?
Thank you. Okay, we have time for more questions and comments.
I have a direct message that maybe I can read out loud that says, I hope that's okay, this person says that you can consider, if you like, whether now or some other time, how have the people who've directly contributed beyond the general structure you referenced to the outsidering you write about, such as the disenfranchisement by bylaw 55 and so, reacted to the publishing of your book, or the broader idea that you're rightly calling out these things? They don't. ASA, I was very nervous, the American Sociological Association. I'm a sociologist and I'm very involved, but I was like picking at my face because I was so nervous. But there were people who who are directly involved, like a new person from the department or relatively new, and just ignored me, right? Or someone who's not in Soc, but is Soc adjacent, who is friends with people who I've had bad experiences with, literally have just kind of seen past me and ignored me, like at least 4 times when we're in the same situation, same circle, and they literally kind of ignore me. And so I did have one person from the department reach out and say, you know, thank you for writing the book and thank you for sharing your stories. And so that's it. And you know, I guess I'm not surprised by that, or maybe I should, you know, like I don't know. But it was very, you know, like retaliation is real and it's hard to quantify because it happens in backstage conversations, whispers about art. Now look, this is a troublemaker, or like, you know, tone down what you're saying, or all of these things. And so, you know, I wrote this book because I had to. I wrote it for me, to be honest. I hope it speaks to others, but I wrote it for me and I couldn't put it back in. And so then I also just have to accept that, you know, there are people, like I tried, as Jade mentioned, for yourself and for herself, is that I tried to do everything right? Like, I tried to do everything right, learn the rules of the game, and yet that didn't stop me from kind of experiencing, you know, gendered racism, all of these outsiderness. And no matter what I do, and I write about this at NWSA, there's a Women of Color Leadership pre-conference, and the facilitator of my group was like, well, no matter what you do, like, there are some people who are never going to accept you. And so I had to like accept that this is just who I am, and people can accept it or they can't. They can withhold things from me, right? Like there are people who are, I'm sure, reviewers and who can knock it down. But I think that too often, you know, I've never been able to, probably to my detriment, not speak out in meetings, because I think there are always reasons to stay quiet. People say, wait till tenure. But then you have tenure and you wait till full. Oh, well, then you're the senior person now. And that is just, I think, it's a way to kind of silence, and it's a way to reproduce the structure. So I wrote it. People will probably be mad. I don't know. Hopefully they don't sue me, but I didn't name anything.
Well, I mean, I think a really important point that you make consistently throughout the book is that this is bigger than any one department. These are systemic and structural issues that are replicated across departments and across institutions, and leaving one department and going to another does not mean that you will then no longer experience being an academic outsider. It looks like we have another question, Alejandra.
I just want to say hi, Victoria, and how thankful I am you're doing this event. I bought this book and read it over the summer, and I'm gonna say that I cried many times while reading this book, and like I felt it very deeply. So I really thank you for writing this book and putting your stories, multiple stories in it. So my question is, I guess, not like, so more than anything, I wanted to share that and share how much this like book lives with me. And I actually I wanted to bring it, hold it, but I brought it to my office. So it's there in like my little table for the first thing my students see as like a piece of conversation, because I feel like that begins to open the door. So like, that's why I'm not holding it, but it's because it's in my office doing work for me. But I wanted to ask about sort of the personal element, right? We're academics here in the setting. I'm coming from the history discipline, and we're told to do very particular things when we write, especially how we position ourselves, or to be very clear about our positionalities, but then like leave ourselves in and out of the story. And I know you're coming from a different discipline and you're in interdisciplinary departments now, but I wondered about sort of that element writing that personal thing into this academic and interweaving it together. And I thought that worked beautifully. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about the process, or how you came comfortable to that or not, or the discomfort with doing these things that we're told not to do in the academy that you had to do to write this book.
Yeah, I mean, I really take a lot of inspiration from people who came before me. So Tressie McMillan Cotton's Thick and in particular, her essay on beauty was like transformative. I was like, this is like, it transformed my way of thinking. Crystal Fleming has the How to Be Less Stupid About Race. Ibram Kendi has the How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? And in each of these aspects, right, like people weave, Lorgia Garcia Pena, I mean, this didn't come out till my book came out, but so I read it afterwards, but she has this book, Community as Rebellion, and it's about her time as being denied tenure at Harvard, right? And so I think like I was just reading a lot of feminists of color, Black feminists in particular, during COVID. And so for me, I'm a writer and I'm a thinker. And I think this debate, right, about objectivity, bias, etc., is something that has been a part of sociology since the Atlanta school, since the Chicago school, and it doesn't seem like we've gone anywhere, that it's the same exact like thing replicating, right? And it's about whiteness as a structure and whiteness as like being able to be unbiased. And so I think that's part of it. And for me, this was also just like, it was a way of processing. So I had to, and I'm an academic, so I think theoretically about these things. So then I was like, well, what do other people say? And like trying to do this. So it was also just like an organic book that I didn't have an audience in mind. I didn't have any of these things in mind. Yeah, so I'm not sure I quite answer that question, but it's like something that has been a fissure in many disciplines.
Mm-hmm. So we have time for just one more question. I see Farah's hand up. Farah?
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I apologize for having my video off. I just got my booster shot, so I'm a little camera unready, shall we say. Anyway, I want to begin by applauding you, Victoria, for a book that I have not yet read, but can't wait to get my hands on, and I will probably, like many others, cry through parts of it. So I want to applaud you, first of all, for bringing the centrality of affect back into the academy and reminding us of its, crucial importance. But my question really, follows up, I think, on the previous person's question, which is, I am in a discipline where those of us who do autobiographical or autoethnographic work are, continually sort of marginalized. Right. And the kinds of things that I think our colleagues say is, well, this is research, not research. So I'm really looking for ammunition from you for the kinds of arguments that I would like to be able to make in response, whether we're discussing a colleague's file or, in any other context. Right. And perhaps I should just read the book and maybe you'll just guide me to particular sections of your book. But I'd really like to hear you go for it on that question. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that, so part of the academic justice essay gets at like, how can we do this in practice? What does it mean to like actually do this in evaluating research and reading it for what it is and the long lineage? I mean, and what I would say is pointing to feminist writings, that this is a part of research. This is, right? So, sorry, I'm reading that. So thinking about this lineage and how kind of who you're talking with, and it's a particular method, right? So it's like twofold. One is talking in the language about a particular type of method for particular arguments, right? So I think that's one way. And really the department itself, I think that's its responsibility, is making that argument and doing that translation work for you. So I think like that's part of it too. And pointing to it being peer reviewed, right? Like it's peer reviewed in a peer reviewed publication, in a journal, in a book. And those are all markers of it. And so I don't know if, I'm sorry, I forgot if you're in like a science or humanities. I know in social sciences, people like use this term objective and research.
Yes, I'm in a science envy department.
Yeah. So yeah, part of this, I mean, I think that there are also like scientists who write about this, right? So Robin Kimmerer, right, and Braiding Sweetgrass, when I think about Shonda, the Disordered Cosmos, who brings kind of her personal experiences to thinking about theoretical physics. And so it's like linking to this lineage of scientific writers. I think we have to wrap up now. I'm sorry, but I hope that's helpful. But part of it is the structure needs to change, right?
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm so sorry that we have to end now. Setsu, I saw your question. Unfortunately, we can't get to it, but maybe Victoria can email you and have that further conversation. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And now I will pass it over to Dylan to close us out.
First, I want to just say how much gratitude I feel for the two of you bringing this forward, and to Victoria for writing this book, putting yourself out there, doing the things that a lot of folks wish they had the backbone to do. So I want to praise you and honor you and embrace you for the backbone that you demonstrate to us here. We all should follow in your example.
I get it from my grandma and from my mom and from like these Filipino women who like,
that's right.
Shit.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, this is not an ethnic chauvinist statement. This is just a real statement. So I appreciate you, Victoria. So thank you, everybody here, for showing the backbone to come, for giving us your time, for embracing this event and the spirit of this event. I will say as well, if you'll indulge me, that there is going to be an end of quarter event that's going to be co-organized and co-sponsored by the center that will feature Victoria as one of our faculty respondents. We'll be inviting some University of California Riverside administrators to be respondents as well. So if any of y'all are on the line right now, expect that email to come. And I put it in the chat. The tentative title is Institutional Culture, in quotes, and the marginalization of arts and humanities scholars, UCR faculty and administrators respond to national research findings. So we would like to open this conversation up, open up some of the themes that came out today, and start to demand some solutions and some action toward what people in our institutions who run our institutions nebulously refer to as cultural change. Let's figure out what the hell that actually is and do it. Your book brings us toward that ever closer, Victoria. So thank you. Most of all, thank you.